but I still didn't know how to talk about it. And Mayors Against Illegal Guns turned into Everytown, and Moms Demand was formed, and they merged together. And then, they provided this place where survivors like me could go. And I met Lucy McBath, whose son Jordan Davis was shot and killed in Florida in a loud music case. I met Richard Martinez, whose son Christopher was shot and killed in Isla Vista mass shooting. And I met Erica Lafferty, whose mom Dawn was shot and killed in the Sandy Hook mass shooting. And when you meet these people, like they will change your life forever. And they first of all they saved my own life, but they introduced me to my voice, and they showed me how that I had a part to play in the movement of ending gun violence, and that it was incumbent upon me to share my story so that folks felt as empowered as I do, and that they had a chance to earn their circumstance rather than it being the other way around. And once that happened, and back in 2013, 14, it was off and running.
I'm so sorry about your mother. That's got to be an incredibly difficult thing to live with, to grow up with.
It is. In fact, up until I was 18, my parents had told me, my entire family had told me that my mom died of a sickness, which I guess, depending how you look at it, her depression itself is what lied to her enough to make her believe that the world would be better off without her. And I can assure you that's not the case. But, not knowing, your mom is tough,
Mm-hmm.
But there are people who go through circumstances similar to mine every single day. I mean, there's a gun suicide every 25 minutes in our country. Every 14 hours, someone in Milwaukee is shot and killed. We have 93 gun deaths in total every day. So my story is not unique at all. Some of the circumstances within it may be a little different than others, but a gun death is a gun death is a gun death. And I learned early on that we don't compare one tragedy to another. There's no gun violence hierarchy here. We all live in a never-ending nightmare, unfortunately. But I can allow this to own me and dictate the rest of my life, or I can do something positive with the nightmare that I've got, and that's what I've chosen to do.
Mm-hmm. So it's fairly unusual, as I understand, for women to commit suicide by gun. Do you know anything about how your mom had access to a gun, or anything from the research I'm sure you've done about would it have made a difference if there hadn't been a gun that she had access to?
Yeah, I wish this wasn't the case. I wish my mom was still here,
Mm-hmm.
ultimately. But I wish, and you'll hear in a second, that a lot of these ideas that people have about gun violence and gun suicides fall in my own story.
Mm-hmm.
So my grandfather gave my mom a gun for self-defense. He taught her how to shoot it, took her to the gun range quite often so she would be able to operate the firearm. And like most people, she used the gun on herself. When you have a gun in the house, you're more inclined to use that gun on yourself or someone you love than you are against an assailant. You'll hear people that will say, if they didn't have a gun, they would try another way. Well, statistically, that's not necessarily true. But in my mom's case, she attempted suicide twice before, both with pills. Pills have a less than 5% lethality rate, while guns have more than a 90% lethality rate. I mean, because there's no, with a pill, you have time to go to the hospital. It's not instant. With a gun, you really don't ever get a second chance. So these things that people will say about gun violence and gun suicide, when you actually look at the stories, they don't really bear out, right? So here you have people thinking, I need a gun for self-defense. Well, someone thought that about my mom too, my grandfather, and she shot herself with it. But again, there are we have a gun suicide every 25 minutes in America right now, and typically it is white men who shoot and kill themselves. But overall, women attempt suicide more frequently, but men complete it more often. And again, it's usually white men that are doing that. So, and it's unfortunate. I honestly wish that there was no controversy around it.
Mm-hmm.
Why should this be something that's controversial that we can't talk about? I mean, if we fail to talk about this issue, it's going to get worse.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, suicides are at a 30-year high right now, all suicides. And so if we fail to act and do the things that we know can actually make a difference, I mean, aren't we complicit? We are helping make that problem worse if we just assume I can't talk about this, or we want to pollute the issue with more politics. You know, the bullet that exploded my mom's head did not stop before it entered her brain and say, "Hey, are you a Republican or Democrat?" Right?
Mm-hmm.
The bullets that riddled the 20 innocent first graders in St. Hook didn't stop before they killed them and say, "Hey, you guys are going to grow up to be Republicans or Democrats." That, I mean, see, when you look at this in an honest context, none of that stuff is real. We make that up. Society does. When I sit with a mom whose daughter or son was just shot and killed, do you think, as she's crying on my shoulder, do you think she's sitting there asking me, "Hey, before I continue crying and telling you some of the worst imaginable things you can think of, are you Republican or Democrat?" That's not how this works. And it's unfortunate that we've allowed it to get to this place.
So, what are some of the ways that Republicans and Democrats could come together? What are some of the types of legislation that we should be trying to push for bipartisan, hopefully non-controversial solutions?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and again, so the controversy part is for one, it's manufactured, and it's manufactured for a reason. But so we know that more than 90% of Americans support universal background checks. Here in Wisconsin, more than 92% of Wisconsin voters support it. And that includes more than 70% of gun owners, more than 70% of NRA members, and more than 70% of Republicans support that. So if we know that we have the overwhelming majority of American support for this, the question is, how come we don't have it?
Mm-hmm.
And that it really becomes simple when you look at it that way, because our Congress, our elected officials have been purchased by the gun lobby. They are paid to obfuscate. They are paid to make things seem as if they are something completely different. I mean, it is mind-boggling when you listen to a politician explain why we shouldn't have universal background checks. Just a week ago, we had one with Representative or Congressman Sean Duffy from Wisconsin explain why we don't have universal background checks, and he said because that's not all you want. If we give you background checks, you're going to want something else, because ultimately what you really want is to eliminate the Second Amendment. And what that tells you is he's now, with the help of the gun lobby, created this idea that because we statistically know this law will work and save people's lives, that somehow we want to take that to the absolute extreme and get rid of an amendment in our Constitution. I mean, if you would apply that logic to any law, we would have no law. But I mean, it is beyond me how someone can get paid a six-figure salary and be allowed to think like that. That should tell you that he's got no interest whatsoever in dealing with gun violence. And that's unfortunate, because there are white folks that die from gun violence just like black folks do. Just in October of 2016, State Representative Rick Gudex shot and killed himself. He was a Republican. Mm-hmm. And the fact that his counterparts aren't doing something to mitigate those kinds of deaths is beyond me. So again, we have universal background checks that, again, we know will save lives. In the states that have universal background checks for all gun sales, we have 48% fewer gun suicides like my mom. We have 48% fewer police officers that are shot and killed. We have 46% fewer women that are shot and killed by a current or former intimate partner. We also have about 46% fewer guns that are trafficked. So that's a real substantive policy that we know will save lives. We also have, depending on the state you go to, they'll call it something different, but it's essentially a gun violence restraining order. And what that will do is if someone is in, the depths of despair, or they're a danger to themselves in one way or the other, you can have, and it depends on where you are, you can petition the court or your local sheriff to have the guns temporarily removed from that person's possession while they get the mental health care help that they need. And so you'll hear when there's a shooting, a Republican will say, it's not a gun problem, it's a mental health issue. I mean, we heard Donald Trump say that after the Las Vegas shooting. Well, if you believe that, and that's not the case, but if you believe that, then how do you not support these kinds of bills that remove the gun from the equation so you have time to get the mental health care? But of course, they don't really believe those things. They're just saying it because it's a talking point. So those two things right there would help save people's lives. But unfortunately, we don't have the kind of politicians who actually believe in saving American lives rather than valuing gun lobby money.
I didn't even know about that, the theoretical option to contact the judge and have guns taken away from someone. I can't say too much about it because it's a family member who doesn't want to be identified, but I've been in the situation of having to go to someone's house and remove guns from their house before they got there.
Right.
And because we were afraid that they would kill themselves. And it would have been really nice to have that option.
Right.
To have somebody else be able to take the guns away from him to keep him safe.
Right. I mean, and when someone, is mentally unwell and a potential danger to themselves or someone else, the last thing they need to have access to is something that can cause lethal damage like a gun. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't, if someone were an alcoholic and you're trying to help save them, are you going to surround your house with alcohol?
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't that seem pretty stupid and mean? You're going to, if you're trying to help save them and help them beat alcoholism, you're going to remove as much alcohol as you can find, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with drug addiction. We have no problem taking those kind of precautionary steps in any other situation other than gun violence. Why? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the drug manufacturers are just as strong as the alcohol lobby is, right? But how come the gun lobby can dictate these kind of policies to our country when we know what we're talking about will save lives? And it boils down to who we elect to positions of power.
So you've also talked about the SAFE Act in Wisconsin, and you advocated for it to become a model for federal legislation.
Right.
So can you tell our listeners what the SAFE Act is and how something like that could help save lives from gun violence?
Oh, absolutely. So let me start by saying that I am a proud Democrat. But the SAFE Act was signed by Scott Walker in 2014. Scott Walker is a Republican governor of Wisconsin. If Scott Walker were in front of me right now, I would give him the biggest hug you can think of, specifically for doing this one thing, because it is that important. So when a person is convicted of a domestic violence charge, they become a prohibited purchaser. So you can't own guns. You can't go buy a gun, things like that. But there is nothing within our federal law that mandates or instructs how to get the guns out of the hands. Get those guns that they may already possess out of their possession, right? So it's not like, if you get convicted of something in one state, the federal law doesn't say, well, you have 48 hours to turn your guns over. It doesn't say that at all. You might get entered into a database that says you can't go buy a new gun, but you still will have those guns in your possession. And so what has happened, states themselves have had to create laws to bridge that gap. And fortunately, Wisconsin is one of them. So in Wisconsin, if you're convicted of a domestic violence charge, you then have 48 hours to turn your guns in. If you don't, a warrant will be issued for your arrest. And so in states that don't have that, you are putting women's lives at risk, because especially after they file the restraining order, they become even more vulnerable and at risk because their partner is even more upset that happened.